We are well aware of how weary you've become of the digital world's noise, the repetitive copy-paste information, and the soulless mechanical voices of artificial intelligence. We felt the exact same way. On this channel, every word you hear is not merely the result of deep historical research, it carries the warmth and sincerity of a real human voice. Our goal is to pull you away from the coldness of the screen and invite you into the most peaceful, silent corners of history. If you too wish to drift off to sleep every night with a new story in the tranquility of the past, you can become part of this silent journey by subscribing to our channel. A heartfelt thank you to all our friends who support us by liking the video. If your mind is ready, dim the lights a little further and let's journey back 200 years into those old, silent and peaceful homes. The architectural landscape of the early 19th century was a testament to the enduring relationship between human necessity and the raw materials provided by the earth. Every dwelling built 2 centuries ago carried within its walls a story of labor and local geography. In this era, the concept of a home was defined by its ability to provide a fortress against the elements, while maintaining a quiet dignity through its proportions. The primary structural elements consisted of thick masonry walls, often constructed from locally quarried limestone, granite or red clay bricks fired in nearby kilns. These materials gave the homes of the 1820s a profound sense of mass and permanence, a weight that could be felt in the very air of the rooms. The thickness of the exterior walls served as the only form of insulation, absorbing the warmth of the sun during the day and slowly releasing it into the interior spaces as the night air grew cold. Inside these structures, the skeleton was formed by massive timber beams, often hand-hewn from old-growth oak or pine. The marks of the adze and the saw were still visible on the surface of the wood, hidden behind layers of lath and plaster. This plaster was a mixture of lime, sand, and animal hair, applied in thick layers to create a surface that was never perfectly flat, but possessed a soft, organic texture. The ceilings were often high in the principal rooms to allow for the circulation of air, while the upper stories and service areas featured lower, more intimate heights. The windows were a defining feature of the period, composed of small, rectangular panes of crown glass. This glass was made by blowing a large sphere and spinning it into a flat disc, resulting in subtle ripples and a central bullseye that distorted the view of the world outside, creating a dreamlike quality to the landscape beyond the glass. The frames were crafted from slender sections of wood, painted in muted earth tones to blend with the stone or brickwork. Doors were heavy and solid, often featuring 6 panels and cast iron or brass hardware that felt cold and substantial to the touch. The layout of the home was a careful study in hierarchy and function, with a central hallway acting as the primary artery for movement. This passage was designed to keep the heat of the hearths contained within the living spaces, whilst providing a buffer against the drafts that inevitably crept through the thresholds. The floors were made of wide planks of heartwood, fastened with hand-forged nails that would occasionally creak under the weight of a footfall. These boards were often left bare or covered with simple woven mats, allowing the natural grain of the wood to show through years of wear and polishing. The foundations were dug deep into the soil, lined with massive fieldstones that remained cool and damp throughout the changing seasons. This subterranean level was the anchor of the house, providing a stable base for the immense weight of the masonry chimneys that rose like pillars through the center of the structure. These chimneys were the heart of the home, often featuring multiple flues to serve fireplaces in every major room. The craftsmanship required to ensure a proper draft was a highly specialized skill, and the sight of a well-proportioned mantelpiece was a symbol of both comfort and status. Above the living quarters, the roof was a complex assembly of rafters and purlins covered in slate tiles, cedar shakes, or lead sheeting, depending on the wealth of the owner and the regional availability of materials. The pitch of the roof was designed to shed snow and rain efficiently, with deep eaves that protected the upper reaches of the walls from the biting winds. In the urban centers, the architecture began to reflect a more uniform approach, with row houses sharing common walls and creating a sense of rhythmic order along the cobblestone streets. Yet even in the city, each home remained a private sanctuary, a quiet world of stone, wood, and plaster that muffled the sounds of the horses and carriages outside. The air inside was often still, carrying the faint scent of drying timber and the earthy aroma of the lime mortar. It was a space that felt secure, a place where the passage of time was marked not by the ticking of a clock, but by the slow movement of light across the textured walls. Crossing the threshold of a home built 2 centuries ago was a sensory experience that instantly detached the visitor from the outside world. The entrance hall was a critical transition zone, a space designed to act as a barrier against the weather while quietly establishing the social standing of the inhabitants. As the heavy front door closed, the immediate sensation was one of profound enclosed silence, a quietude that felt thick and substantial, completely absorbing the external sounds of passing horse hooves, distant shouting, or the rustle of wind through the trees. The air in this vestibule was distinct, usually several degrees cooler than the heated parlors, and heavy with the unique combination of odors that defined the era. The smell was a compound of dampness rising from the foundations, the sharp tang of wet wool cloaks hanging on forged iron pegs, and the ubiquitous scent of the tallow or beeswax candles that provided the only illumination during the long dark hours. The flooring underfoot was chosen for utility and durability, often large, irregular flagstones laid directly onto the earth, or white planks of oak that had darkened to a deep espresso hue through decades of traffic and polishing with linseed oil. These surfaces were cold to the touch, a chill that could be felt even through thick, leather-soled boots, and the stones often held a slight sheen of moisture from condensation in the humid air. Illumination was sparse, typically restricted to a small, semicircular fanlight window above the door, which offered only a gray, diffused light during the day and allowed the cold, pale moonlight to filter through at night, creating elongated shadows that danced along the narrow corridor. A lone candle or a primitive oil lamp on a simple side table might be lit for arrivals after dark, its flame flickering wildly in the drafts that constantly seeped through the ill-fitting doorframe, casting an unsteady warm glow that barely penetrated the gloom. The walls were frequently painted in deep somber earth tones, such as ochre, umber, or a rich gray blue, colors chosen less for aesthetics and more for their ability to hide the inevitable scuffs, dirt, and smoke stains associated with daily life. Furnishings were minimal, perhaps a sturdy oak bench for visitors waiting to be received, a simple stand for hats and walking sticks, and perhaps a long case clock made of mahogany, its slow rhythmic pendulum providing a comforting, monotonous ticking that served as the heartbeat of the quiet house. This space was the barrier between the public sphere and the private, family-centered rooms, and its atmosphere was one of quiet dignity, sobriety, and a deep sense of enclosure, separating the inhabitant and the guest alike from the natural elements and the noise of the 19th century world outside. The stillness enveloping this entrance was all-consuming, a moment of suspension before entering the more intimate parts of the home, allowing the visitor to adjust to the dim light and the slower tempo of life indoors. The olfactory identity of an interior in the early 19th century was fundamentally anchored in the deep, grounding essence of seasoned timber and the meticulous, labor-intensive application of natural waxes that served as the primary preservative for the domestic environment. This was an era where the concept of home was inextricably linked to the raw materials of the earth, and the scent of a room began with the very skeleton of the structure itself. The massive hand-hewn oak beams that formed the ceiling joists and the expansive, wide-planked pine floors that stretched across every chamber. These woods carried within them a lingering, resinous memory of the ancient forests from which they were harvested, a scent that was released with excruciating slowness over many decades as the timber settled into the heavy masonry of the walls. However, the most pervasive and defining aroma of the 1820s was the ubiquitous scent of beeswax polish, a substance that was applied with a rhythmic, almost meditative regularity to protect and enhance the beauty of every wooden surface. To prepare this essential household commodity, raw honeycombs were meticulously melted down in iron pots and filtered through layers of fine muslin to remove every trace of impurity, leaving behind a golden, floral wax that carried the faint, sweet essence of summer meadows and sun-drenched hives. This natural wax was then thinned with spirits of turpentine, a sharp, medicinal and bracing liquid distilled from the resin of pine trees, which created a scent profile that was simultaneously warm and astringent. The physical application of this mixture was a task of immense endurance, requiring hours upon hours of vigorous, circular buffing with soft woolen rags or discarded pieces of flannel until the grain of the wood achieved a deep, mirror-like luster. As the wax was worked into the porous surface of the mahogany, walnut, or cherry wood, the friction of the cloth generated a subtle, localized heat that released volatile oils into the still, unventilated air of the room, creating a thick, velvety atmosphere that seemed to cling to the skin. Over the passage of years, these countless layers of wax and labor built up into a substantial, protective patina that effectively trapped the history of the household within its translucent, amber depths. The scent became deeply embedded in the heavy, floor-to-ceiling velvet curtains, the dense horsehair upholstery of the settees, and even the delicate silk wall coverings, creating a permanent olfactory backdrop that defined the very soul of the house. In the winter months, when the heavy oak shutters were pulled tight against the freezing night and the windows were sealed with strips of felt to block the biting drafts, the aroma of beeswax and turpentine would concentrate and intensify, mingling with the dry, acrid smell of wood smoke from the hearth and the faint, metallic tang of cold iron to create a dense cocoon of domestic security. It was a smell that signaled stability and the meticulous care required to maintain a high-status home in an age before the convenience of mass-produced chemical cleaners. Walking through a darkened hallway in the middle of the night, the resident would be guided as much by this familiar, grounding scent as by the pale, ethereal moonlight filtering through the small window panes. The air itself felt heavy and substantial, carrying the collective weight of generations of polishing and the quiet, enduring presence of the timber that provided the shelter. This fragrance did not merely drift through the rooms. It seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the floorboards and the intricate carvings of the mantelpieces, providing a constant, silent reminder of the tactile relationship between the human hand and the natural world. Every small object, from the handle of a silver-backed hairbrush to the edge of a massive writing desk or the ornate frame of a pier mirror, contributed its own small note to this grand aromatic landscape. The beeswax acted as a physical and spiritual preservative, not just for the wood, but for the memories of those who touched and maintained it, leaving a faint, slightly tacky residue that felt honest and real beneath the fingertips. It was a pure, unadulterated smell, entirely devoid of the synthetic, cloying perfumes that would characterize later centuries, reflecting a time when the beauty of a home was measured by the depths of its hand-polished sheen and the persistent, comforting fragrance of the earth's own bounty. The scent of the 1820s home was the scent of preservation. A quiet, lingering testament to the endurance of the domestic sphere and the natural materials that bound the family together in a world of silence and shadow. Section 4. Fireplace and Hearth Culture. The fireplace and hearth culture. The fireplace served as the absolute and unwavering gravitational center of the domestic world in the early 19th century, acting as the primary source of survival against the encroaching cold and the literal heart of the architectural body. Every house was built around the massive vertical column of the chimney stack, a structure often made of thousands of hand-pressed red bricks or heavy, unyielding fieldstones that rose from the basement to the roof line. The hearth itself was a stage for the constant, rhythmic labor of maintaining life, where the physical presence of the fire dictated the movement and the positioning of every inhabitant. During the long, silent nights of the 1820s, the sounds emanating from the fireplace provided a subtle, percussive soundtrack to the stillness of the home. The sharp, sudden pop of drying sap within a log of seasoned oak, the soft, rhythmic hiss of escaping steam, and the occasional, heavy thud of a collapsing charred limb as it settled into a bed of glowing, white-hot ash. The management of this fire was a specialized and endless task, beginning with the careful selection of timber, usually hardwood like maple, beech, or hickory, which burned slowly and provided a steady, radiating heat that seeped into the surrounding masonry. The warmth was never uniform, creating a distinct geography within the room where those closest to the hearth felt the intense, dry heat against their skin, while the air just a few feet away remained sharp and biting. This temperature gradient was a constant reality of life, leading to the use of heavy, high-backed chairs designed to trap the warmth and shield the sitter from the cold drafts that inevitably pulled toward the fire. The tools of the hearth were made of heavy, cold iron, forged by hand and kept within reach of the stone apron. The poker, the tongs, and the wide-bladed shovel each had a specific purpose in the ritual of tending the embers. The scent of the fireplace was perhaps its most enduring characteristic, a complex and heavy aroma of burnt carbon, wood smoke, and the faint, metallic tang of the iron grate. This smell was not merely temporary, but became a permanent layer of the home's identity, clinging to the heavy wool curtains, the horsehair upholstery, and even the pages of the books in the library. In the deepest hours of the night, as the household slept, the fire would be carefully banked, a process of covering the remaining embers with a thick layer of cool ash to preserve the heat for the following morning. The visual landscape of the hearth at midnight was one of profound shadow and soft, ethereal light. The dying embers would cast a low, pulsing glow that painted the walls in long, distorted shapes, while the pale, blue moonlight from the windows would cut through the darkness to create a sharp contrast of temperatures and colors. The mantelpiece above the fire was often the only decorative element in the room, a shelf of polished mahogany or carved limestone that held the family's most essential items, perhaps a pair of brass candlesticks, a small tinderbox, or a clock that marked the slow, deliberate passage of time. The chimney flue itself was a dark, soot-lined passage to the sky, which required periodic cleaning by hand to prevent the dangerous accumulation of creosote. The soot was a fine, black powder that seemed to find its way into every crack and crevice of the room, a silent reminder of the fire's constant presence. Even in the summer months when the hearth remained cold, it stood as a silent monument to the family's gathered history, filled with a decorative arrangement of dried herbs or a ceramic jar to hide the darkened interior. The relationship between the inhabitant and the hearth was one of mutual dependence. The fire provided the heat and light necessary for existence, while the human hand provided the constant, vigilant care required to keep the flames alive. It was a quiet, elemental bond that defined the very essence of what it meant to be home, providing a sense of security and continuity that is almost entirely lost in the modern era of invisible, automated heating. The stillness of a room with a dying fire was a unique form of peace, where the only movement was the slow, lazy drift of a stray spark, and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of the wind in the chimney. The masonry of the firebox was often protected by a heavy cast iron fireback, decorated with simple geometric patterns or heraldic symbols that would absorb the heat and radiate it back into the room long after the flames had subsided. This iron plate would expand and contract with a metallic groan, adding another layer to the auditory atmosphere of the sleeping house. The floor directly in front of the hearth was always made of non-combustible material, usually large flagstones or a thick layer of brick, which felt rough and dusty under the touch of a hand. This area was often covered in a fine layer of grey dust, a byproduct of the daily cycle of combustion that required constant sweeping. The air near the ceiling was significantly warmer than the air near the floor, creating a vertical stratification of climate that influenced everything from the placement of beds to the height of the windows. In many homes, the kitchen hearth was even larger than the one in the parlor, featuring a massive lintel stone and a complex system of iron cranes and pothooks for cooking. The central fire was never truly extinguished, serving as the eternal flame from which all other household fires were lit. The ritual of the fire was the ritual of the home itself, a quiet, smoky, and intensely tactile experience that anchored the human spirit to the physical reality of the earth and the seasons. In the early 19th century, the experience of artificial light was a rare, precious, and fundamentally unstable luxury that defined the boundaries of human activity after sunset, and the quality of this light was as distinct as the materials that produced it. The dominance of the sun was absolute, and when darkness descended upon the landscape, it was a profound, almost physical blanket that enveloped the home, forcing a radical contraction of life into small, localized pools of flickering illumination. The primary tool for combating this midnight was the candle, but not the smooth, clean-burning wax cylinders of the modern era. For the majority of households in the 1820s, illumination meant tallow candles rendered from the hard fat of cattle or sheep, which was a tedious and smelly domestic cord that produced a soft, yellowish, and often smoky light. A tallow candle burned quickly, required constant attention to trim the wick, and emitted a heavy, slightly acrid scent of animal fat that mingled with the existing smells of wood smoke and damp plaster. When a candle was lit, it did not banish the darkness, but rather created a fragile buffer against it, a pulsing, dancing flame that was sensitive to the slightest draft and cast monstrous, animated shadows that moved across the textured walls. The light itself was dim, perhaps 1/100th the intensity of a modern bulb, demanding that anyone wishing to read, sew, or write must sit in close proximity to the flame, concentrating the family around a single table and intensifying the quiet intimacy of the domestic circle. The visual effect was one of deep chiaroscuro, where faces and objects would emerge from the gloom only to be swallowed back into shadow with the slightest movement of the candle. In wealthier homes, beeswax candles provided a cleaner, longer-lasting, and sweeter-smelling alternative, but they were expensive and reserved for special occasions or the most important rooms, leaving the service areas and simpler chambers in near-total darkness. Beyond the candle, the primitive oil lamp, burning whale or colza oil, offered a steadier but equally dim light, often requiring its own ritual of wick maintenance and glass cleaning. The scarcity of light meant that activities were compressed into the daylight hours, and the nocturnal rhythm was dictated by the rising and setting of the moon, which provided a cool blue counterpoint to the warm yellow light of the hearth and candle. The darkness itself was an active presence, a silence that felt heavy and substantial, muffling the sounds of the natural world outside and creating a sense of profound isolation and safety within the limited circle of artificial light. The kitchen of the 1820s was a cavernous and sensory-heavy domain, situated in the lowest or most remote part of the dwelling. Designed to contain the heat, the noise, and the powerful aromas of constant labor. The physical foundation of this space was almost always composed of heavy flagstones or hard-fired bricks, materials chosen for their resistance to the embers that inevitably escaped the hearth and for their ability to be scrubbed with harsh lye and sand. These floors remained perpetually cool, a subterranean chill that rose through the soles of one's shoes even in the height of summer, while the air near the ceiling was thick and heavy with the rising warmth of the cooking fires. The walls were coated in thick layers of lime wash, a bright, chalky substance that was reapplied annually to maintain a sense of cleanliness. Though the area surrounding the chimney was permanently etched with a fine, gray patina of soot, the focal point of the entire room was the massive open hearth. A deep stone alcove equipped with a complex system of wrought iron cranes and adjustable pothooks. This was the primary engine of the home, where heavy cast iron kettles and copper pans hung over a bed of glowing coals, their surfaces blackened by years of exposure to direct flame. In some of the more progressive homes of this decade, one might find the early iterations of the cast iron range, a heavy black behemoth of a machine that promised a more controlled heat but still required a constant, vigilant supply of wood or coal. The furniture in the kitchen was built for utility and endurance, dominated by a massive, central work table made of thick planks of pine or maple. The surface of this table was a landscape of history, worn smooth by generations of rolling dough, chopping vegetables, and the rhythmic scrubbing of sand and water. It possessed a pale, almost velvety texture that felt soft and organic to the touch. Surrounding the walls were simple open shelves or heavy, built-in cupboards that held the daily ceramic ware. Simple yellowware or cream-colored stoneware that felt heavy and substantial in the hand. The air in the kitchen was never truly still. It carried a complex, layered aroma that shifted with the seasons but always maintained a base note of old wood smoke, rendered fat, and the sharp, herbal scent of bundles of sage, rosemary, and thyme drying from the ceiling beams. In the silence of the night, the kitchen took on a different character. A place of profound shadows and deep, indigo hues, where the only light came from the dying embers of the hearth or the pale blue moonlight filtering through a small, high-set window. The copper vessels hanging from their iron racks would catch this dim light, casting a faint, metallic sheen that cut through the gloom. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional, rhythmic drip of water from a stone sink or the settling of the massive house as the temperature dropped. This was a space of absolute functionality, devoid of the decorative flourishes found in the upper floors, yet it possessed a raw, honest beauty in the arrangement of its tools and the integrity of its materials. The heavy mortars and pestles made of solid marble, the hand-forged iron ladles, and the wooden bowls carved from single blocks of burl. Each item was a testament to a world where objects were made to last for lifetimes. The connection to the earth was palpable here, from the scent of the root vegetables stored in dark, sandy bins to the cold, damp stone of the masonry. It was the most primitive and essential room in the house, a sanctuary of heat and nourishment that anchored the entire domestic structure to the physical world. The transition from the open flame to the early stove marked a quiet revolution in the domestic experience. Yet in the 1820s, the tradition of the hearth remained the dominant force, creating a visual and auditory landscape that was both rugged and deeply comforting. The low, flickering orange glow of the banked fire fighting against the encroaching blue of the midnight air, creating a space where the past felt tangible and the modern world was a distant, impossible thought. As the heavy, iron-bound door was bolted for the night, the kitchen settled into a cold, starlit peace. leaving only the faint smell of wood smoke and the memory of the day's fire. The procurement of water in the 1820s was a fundamental and laborious ritual that dictated the rhythm of domestic life, anchoring the household to the primal necessity of the element and the physical geography of the immediate landscape. This was an era before the luxury of invisible infrastructure, where every drop used for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and bathing had to be physically extracted from the earth and carried into the dwelling, leaving a sensory map of effort and value upon the memory of its inhabitants. The physical source of this vital supply was most frequently a backyard pump, a solitary sentinel of cast iron and wood that stood over a deep well sunk into the cool, dark water table. To operate this mechanism was a task of rhythmic endurance, requiring the grasp of a heavy, cold iron handle that had been worn smooth by countless hands and seasons. The act of pumping was a full-body exertion, starting with the resistant creak of the dry leathers inside the cylinder, followed by the slow, sucking gurgle as the vacuum was established, and finally culminating in the sudden, splashing rush of the water as it gushed into a waiting wooden bucket or earthenware jug. The water itself, drawn from the deepest strata of the earth, possessed a profound, bone-deep chill that could be felt instantly through the sides of the vessel, even on the most suffocating nights of midsummer. It carried a distinct olfactory identity. A clean, mineral scent mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of the iron pump and the earthy aroma of the damp ground surrounding the brick apron. In the deep stillness of the night, when the household slept and the world was enveloped in indigo shadow and pale blue moonlight, the backyard pump remained a quiet monument to the day's labor. It stood alone in the dark yard, its form catching the low, cool light from the moon, casting a low, cool light from the moon, casting a sharp, elongated shadow across the cobblestones. A stray bucket might be left beneath the spout, its surface still, reflecting the starlight like a dark mirror. The silence surrounding the pump at midnight was absolute, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl or the soft rustle of leaves, making the memory of its daytime noise, the creaking, clanking, and splashing feel like a distant echo. In some grander townhouses, a lead or copper cistern in the kitchen might hold a small reserve, filled painfully by hand or by a primitive force pump from the cellar, but the reality for the majority was the repetitive journey to the yard. A single bath required dozens of such trips, heating the heavy water over the open kitchen hearth, creating a complex relationship where water was both a scarce resource to be conserved and a precious medium for purification. The difficulty of this procurement meant that cleanliness was treated with immense respect, and the physical weight of water became a conscious part of the domestic experience. As the moon traveled across the dark blue vault of the night sky, the backyard pump settled into its nocturnal rest, the water inside its mechanism slowly retreating to the well, leaving only the cold iron handle and the memory of the day's flow, a silent testament to the laborious intimacy between human necessity and the raw materials of the earth in an age of profound silence and shadow. The proximity of the well to other domestic structures, such as the privy or the stable, created a constant unspoken anxiety about contamination, adding a layer of risk to the daily hydration. Yet in the quietude of the 1820s night, the water supply stood as a grounding presence, a cold, clear link to the forces of nature that ultimately sustained the quiet, enduring world inside the stone and timber walls. The larder of an 1820s home was a sanctuary of preservation, a cold, subterranean or north-facing chamber where the survival of the family was measured in the density of its stone shelves and the meticulous arrangement of its ceramic crocks. Entering this space in the middle of the night, one was immediately struck by the profound, heavy stillness of the air, which was several degrees cooler than the rest of the house. It carried a complex and pungent olfactory map of the harvest, a thick aroma composed of sharp, vinegary pickles, the earthy scent of root vegetables stored in boxes of dry sand, and the deep, salty tang of cured meats hanging from the ceiling joists. The walls were often thick masonry, coated in a rough white lime wash that flaked slightly under the touch, reflecting the pale blue moonlight that filtered through a single barred window. This light was weak, barely illuminating the rows of salt-glazed stoneware jars that lined the shelves, each one containing a different facet of the winter's sustenance. The surfaces of these jars felt cool, smooth, and slightly tacky to the fingers. Their heavy lids, sealed with layers of wax or oil-soaked parchment to exclude the air. The floor was typically made of hard-packed earth or irregular flagstones, which remained damp and cold throughout the changing seasons, providing a natural refrigeration system that relied on the thermal mass of the ground. In the corners, massive wooden bins held the staples of life: flour, cornmeal, and oats, their grain-scented dust settling into a fine gray layer over the surrounding surfaces. Hanging from the massive hand-hewn timber beams were bundles of dried herbs: sage, rosemary, and thyme, their shriveled leaves brittle and aromatic, releasing a faint, dusty fragrance into the still air. Alongside them hung slabs of bacon and hams, encased in heavy canvas bags and coated in a layer of black pepper or salt to deter the insects. The visual landscape of the larder was one of extreme order and necessity, a place where every object had a specific purpose and a long, labor-intensive history. There were no colorful labels or transparent containers, only the honest textures of wood, clay, stone, and cloth. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the occasional rhythmic drip of condensation or the soft, scurrying sound of a mouse in the rafters. The darkness was a tool of preservation, protecting the delicate oils and vitamins in the food from the degrading effects of sunlight. The storage of root vegetables involved large rectangular wooden chests filled with dry, coarse sand, a technique that mimicked the cool, dark environment of the earth itself. Digging a hand into this sand revealed the hidden forms of carrots, parsnips, and heavy soil-encrusted potatoes, each one cool to the touch and carrying the faint, damp smell of the garden. The sand felt gritty and abrasive, falling through the fingers with a soft, shushing sound that was the only noise in the room. Above these bins, the shelves of slate or limestone were packed with the results of the summer's pickling. Jars of cucumbers, onions, and hard-boiled eggs suspended in a sharp, amber brine that shimmered with a dull, metallic light in the blue shadows. The ceramic vessels themselves were works of utilitarian art, their salt-glazed surfaces featuring deep, cobalt blue decorations of birds or flowers that seemed to pulse with life in the dim, ethereal moonlight. The seals of these jars were a matter of life and death, often consisting of a layer of animal bladder stretched tight over the rim and tied with hemp twine, then coated in a thick, dark layer of sealing wax that smelled of resin and old forests. The task of opening such a jar was a deliberate and slow process, a ritual of breaking the seal and releasing the trapped scent of a previous season. The ceiling of the larder was a forest of its own, draped with heavy braided ropes of onions and garlic that cast long, bulbous shadows against the whitewashed walls. These vegetables were dry and papery, their skins rustling like dead leaves in the slight drafts that moved through the room. The coldness of the larder was not merely a physical temperature but a psychological state, a feeling of profound isolation and readiness. It was the most honest room in the house, a place where the connection between the land and the table was visible in every shadow and felt in every textured surface. The floorboards near the door were worn thin by the passage of feet, a path of history that led back to the kitchen hearth, but the further one moved into the depths of the larder. The modern world of the 1820s seemed to vanish. replaced by the timeless elemental laws of salt and cold. The air near the floor was the coldest, a pocket of dense, heavy oxygen that seemed to freeze the very movement of time, while the air near the rafters carried the lingering, sweet warmth of the drying herbs. This vertical climate was a carefully managed ecosystem, where the most delicate items were placed on the highest shelves to benefit from the slight warmth, while the heavy meats and root bins occupied the cold, damp floor. The silence of the room was a heavy, velvet blanket, muffling the distant sounds of the household and the natural world, creating a sanctuary where the only reality was the preservation of life. The moon, casting its pale, blue light through the iron bars of the window, painted a grid of shadows across the stone floor, a celestial clock that marked the slow, silent progress of the night. It was a place of deep, indigo peace, where the only movement was the slow, lazy drift of a stray spark, and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of the house settling into its foundations. The weight of the jars, the roughness of the sand, the sharpness of the vinegar, and the coldness of the stone all combined to create a sensory experience that was both rugged and deeply comforting, providing a sense of security and continuity that is almost entirely lost in the modern era of automated cooling. As the household slept, the larder stood as a silent sentinel, its contents a promise of survival against the freezing nights and the long months of winter. It was a space where the past, present, and future were bound together in a single, dark chamber of stone and wood. The evening meal in an 1820s home was not merely a mechanical intake of nourishment, but a deeply structured, ritualistic event that reinforced social hierarchy and established the temporal boundary between the active day and the enclosed night. Assembling around the dining table was a collective transition, a moment when the disparate activities of the household coalesced into a singular, localized focus. This focus was physically manifested by the dining table itself, often a massive, dark expanse of polished mahogany or walnut that dominated the formal dining room. A space dedicated solely to this repetitive ceremony. During the deep stillness of the midnight hour, this room held the ghostly memory of the evening's gathering, its atmosphere thick with lingering scents and the cool, indigo light filtering from a pale moon through the narrow window panes. The sensory landscape of the 1820s dinner began with the lighting, which was sparse and strategically placed. Wealthy families utilized expensive beeswax candles in elaborate candelabras, creating a sweet, floral aroma and a warm, steady glow, but for most, the room was illuminated by the flickering, unsteady flame of tallow candles, rendered from mutton or beef fat, which emitted a heavy, acrid odor that mingled with the smells of the food. This lighting created profound pools of shadow, forcing the diners to lean in close to the table, intensifying the intimacy of the gathering while leaving the corners of the room in near total darkness. The furniture demanded a specific posture. The chairs were high-backed and unyielding, designed with the rigid formality that required the sitters to maintain an upright, disciplined bearing, which was considered a reflection of moral character. The surfaces of these chairs, often covered in dense horsehair or woven tapestry, felt rough and abrasive against the skin, a constant tactile reminder of the social order. The table settings themselves were works of heavy, utilitarian structure. The tablecloth was made of thick, hand-woven flax linen, which felt cool and slightly coarse to the touch, its pale surface absorbing the weak candlelight, and requiring immense labor to wash and press into crisp folds. The plates were substantial ceramic ware, creamware or pearlware. Each piece possessed a significant weight and a smooth, cool glaze that held the heat of the food. The sounds of the meal were distinct and rhythmic, dominated by the muffled clatter of heavy pewter or silver-plated cutlery against the ceramic plates, a slow, percussive soundtrack to the evening. Conversation was rarely animated or loud, but rather a low, murmured exchange of polite inquiries and formal statements, as silence during the meal was often considered a sign of respectful attendance to the food and the company. The aromas of the dinner were powerful and pervasive, dominated by the heavy sense of long-boiled meats, roasted root vegetables, and perhaps the sharp tang of pickled chutneys or the earthy smell of freshly baked bread. These smells would saturate the heavy velvet curtains and the lath and plaster walls, becoming a permanent, unseen layer of the room's identity. The ritual required a specific progression of labor. Servants, if present, moved with quiet efficiency in the shadows, removing dishes and replacing them by synchronized movements. The physical weight of the ceramic tureens, the coldness of the silver spoons, and the warmth radiating from the central fire all contributed to a sensory experience that was both grounding and deeply structured. As the meal concluded, the ritual often shifted to the separation of the sexes, the removal of the tablecloth, and the lingering presence of port wine or nuts, adding new olfactory notes of rich fruit and wood smoke to the air. In the profound stillness of the night, long after the family had retired, the dining room remained a quiet monument to this daily ceremony. The massive mahogany table catching the cold blue light of the moon, its surface clear of dishes, but holding within its polished grain the accumulated memory of countless meals. The silence of the room was a heavy, velvet blanket, muffling the distant sounds of the house and the natural world, creating a sanctuary where the only reality was the physical structure of the table and the enduring hierarchy of the 1820s domestic life. The relationship between the diner and the table was one of mutual formality, a quiet, elemental bond that anchored the human spirit to the physical reality of sustenance and structure in an age of profound silence and shadow. The weight of the silver, the texture of the linen, the scent of the tallow, and the coldness of the ceramic all combined to create a sensory experience that was both rugged and deeply structured, providing a sense of security and continuity that is almost entirely lost in the modern era. As the household slept, the dining table stood as a silent sentinel, its form a promise of the morning's return and the inevitable reassembly of the domestic order. The sitting room of the 1820s was the inner sanctum of the domestic sphere, a space dedicated to the quiet cultivation of family bonds and the deliberate retreat from the formal rigors of the outside world. It was here that the true character of the home's inhabitants was most visible in the arrangement of the furniture and the choice of the tactile materials that filled the room. The atmosphere was defined by a profound, heavy sense of enclosure, created by the thick masonry walls and the heavy, floor-to-ceiling draperies made of dense wool or velvet in deep crimson, forest green, or midnight blue. These fabrics served a vital functional purpose, acting as thermal barriers that trapped the warmth of the hearth while muffling the sounds of the household and the nocturnal world beyond the glass. The walls themselves were often covered in intricate, hand-locked wallpapers featuring delicate floral or neoclassical motifs, their surfaces possessing a matte, slightly powdery texture that absorbed the dim light and added a layer of visual depth to the shadows. The visual landscape of the parlor at night was a study in soft, flickering light and deep, velvet shadows. The primary illumination came from a few strategically placed candles or a small whale oil lamp, casting a warm golden glow that barely reached the corners of the room, leaving them in a permanent, mysterious gloom where the heavy mahogany cabinets and tall bookcases seemed to dissolve into the darkness. The furniture was designed with a specific, upright elegance, featuring chairs and sofas upholstered in black horsehair, a material that was incredibly durable but possessed a stiff, slightly prickly texture that reminded the sitter of their posture and the gravity of the social space. The wood of these pieces was often deep, dark mahogany or rich walnut, polished with beeswax until it held a mirror-like sheen that caught the stray glints of firelight. The central focus was always the fireplace, its mantelpiece carved from dark marble or polished wood, holding the family's most cherished objects: a silhouette portrait, a small porcelain figurine, or a brass clock that marked the slow, rhythmic passage of time with a heavy, metallic tick. This sound was the heartbeat of the room, a constant, reassuring reminder of the steady flow of life in an age before the frantic pace of the future. The scent of the room was a complex and comforting layer of wood smoke, beeswax, and the faint, floral aroma of dried lavender kept in small silk sachets or ceramic bowls. The floor was typically covered in a heavy, woven carpet with intricate floral patterns in shades of indigo and ochre, which felt thick and soft underfoot, providing another layer of insulation against the cold. White planked floorboards beneath. During the long, silent evenings, the family would gather in the small circle of light near the fire, the only sounds being the soft, rhythmic click of knitting needles, the turning of a heavy paper page, or the occasional, low murmur of a private conversation. There were no distractions of flickering screens or mechanical hums. Only the absolute, grounding presence of the physical world and the shared silence of the night. The windows, with their small, rippled panes of crown glass, would catch the pale blue light of the moon, creating a sharp contrast with the warm glow of the fire and painting the walls with distorted, ethereal shadows of the trees outside. The air was often still and heavy, carrying the collective weight of the day's activities and the deep, enduring peace of a well-maintained home. As the night progressed and the fire began to settle into a bed of glowing embers, the room would grow increasingly cool, forcing the inhabitants to retreat closer to the warmth, a physical manifestation of the intimacy and protection that the home provided. The transition from the active day to the nocturnal rest was a slow, deliberate process, marked by the extinguishing of the candles and the final, lingering look at the familiar, shadowed shapes of the furniture, which seemed to take on a life of their own in the dim, starlit air. The sitting room was the heart of the private life, a sanctuary of texture, scent, and silence that anchored the 1820s family to the enduring rhythms of the earth and the seasons. Every object in the room, from the cold iron of the fire tools to the soft silk of a sewing box, carried the weight of history and the promise of continuity. It was a world where the passage of time was felt in the cooling of the air and the slow movement of the shadows, providing a sense of security and belonging that was as substantial as the stone walls themselves. The silence of the room was not empty but filled with the unvoiced thoughts and the shared presence of those who called it home, a deep, indigo peace that enveloped the spirit and prepared it for the long, dreamless hours of sleep. The heavy, sealing the warmth inside and leaving the room to its nocturnal vigil. As the moonlight traveled across the carpet, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air, it revealed the intricate textures of the woven fibers and the deep grain of the wood, a silent testament to the quiet, enduring beauty of the 1820s domestic life. The air near the ceiling remained slightly warmer, holding the ghost of the evening's warmth, while the floor grew cold, creating a vertical world of temperature that dictated where one sat and how one moved. The heavy, upholstered wingback chairs offered the final refuge, their high sides shielding the occupant from the phantom drafts that crept across the floorboards. It was a place where the darkness was not feared but welcomed as a natural conclusion to the day's labor, a soft, blue-tinted envelope that signaled the time for deep, restorative rest in the heart of the silent house. The study corner or library was a dedicated sanctuary for quiet contemplation. Located away from the main living areas, designed to contain the accumulated knowledge of the household, this was a room defined by deep, abiding stillness, an atmosphere that felt heavy with the scent of history and intellectual pursuit, a sensory combination unique to the 1820s. The most pervasive odor was the grounding, sophisticated smell of old paper, a blend of rag linen and leather bindings. Many volumes were bound by hand in calfskin or sheepskin, their spines darkened and smoothed by years of contact with warm fingers, a patina that caught the stray glints of weak candlelight and held within its pores the faint, sweet dust that settled inevitably in unventilated spaces. Entering this room in the deep of night, perhaps to seek a specific volume or finish correspondence, the inhabitant was immediately enveloped in a profound silence, a quietude that seemed to emanate from the very shelves. Thousands of pages acting as a sound-absorbing barrier against the outside world and the rest of the house. The physical architecture of knowledge was visible in the floor-to-ceiling wooden bookcases, often crafted from local pine or cherry wood, their shelves groaning under the weight of history, philosophy, and literature. The lower shelves held the massive, heavy folios, while the upper reaches were reserved for more intimate octavos, accessible only by a small, rolling ladder. The visual landscape of the study at midnight was a study in soft chiaroscuro, a lone tallow or beeswax candle on the writing desk creating a localized pool of warm, amber light that barely pushed back the encroaching indigo gloom of the room. This light was just sufficient to illuminate the immediate tasks, rendering reading or writing a slow, deliberate act that required physical proximity to the flame. The focal point of the labor was the massive mahogany secretary desk, a complex piece of furniture with myriad small drawers and secret compartments, its drop-front writing surface covered in worn green baize or scuffed leather, which felt cool and smooth under the hand. Upon this surface rested the tools of correspondence, an earthenware or pewter inkwell, a sandcaster for drying the ink, and the essential quill pen, often carved from a goose or raven feather. The act of writing was an auditory experience. The sharp, rhythmic scratching of the quill against the textured, cream-colored paper, providing the only counterpoint to the ticking of the bracket clock on the mantelpiece. This clock, with its slow, resonant pendulum, served as the steady heartbeat of the room, a metallic tick that measured the silent flow of thought. The smell of the study was augmented by other elements. The sharp, medicinal tang of spirits of turpentine used in the wax polish for the wood, and the distinct, smoky aroma of sealing wax melted over a small alcohol lamp to secure a letter, a scent that lingered long in the still air. The floor was typically bare white planks of oak or pine, worn unevenly over decades, occasionally covered by a simple woven mat of jute or wool near the desk to provide a modicum of warmth for the sitter. The windows, with their small, rippled panes of crown glass, allowed the pale, cool light of the moon to filter through, painting a grid of shadows across the floorboards and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silent air. This moonlight provided a sharp contrast to the warm glow of the candle, highlighting the textures of the stone walls and the intricate patterns of the spines on the shelves. The air in the study was often cooler than the rest of the house, a consequence of the minimal heating and the presence of paper, a material that naturally absorbed humidity. The fireplace, if present, was rarely kept at full blast, a banked fire of glowing embers providing a subtle warmth and a low, pulsing orange light that added another dimension to the shifting shadows. A high-backed wing chair often stood near the hearth, covered in worn, dimpled leather, providing a solitary refuge for reading, its deep sides shielding the occupant from the phantom drafts that inevitably pulled toward the chimney. It was a space where the value of a book was deeply felt, each volume representing a significant investment of capital and labor, a prized possession that connected the isolated 1820s family to the broader world of ideas and events. The silence of the room was filled with the unspoken voices of the past, A deep, comforting indigo peace that enveloped the spirit and allowed for the profound concentration that is almost entirely lost in the modern era of constant noise and distraction. The study corner was more than a room, it was a state of mind. A quiet, enduring landscape of leather, ink and paper that anchored the human soul to the eternal pursuit of understanding. As the hours of the night stretched toward morning, the candle would burn low, casting increasingly frantic shadows until it was finally extinguished, leaving the study to its silent, moonlit vigil, the scent of old paper and dust, providing a comforting olfactory backdrop for the transition into deep, restorative sleep. The heavy paneled door would be closed, sealing the knowledge and the stillness inside, a sanctuary of thought waiting for the return of the sun. The windows of an 1820s dwelling served as the fragile, translucent threshold between the controlled environment of the domestic interior and the raw, unpredictable forces of the natural world. These openings were not the expansive, crystal-clear voids of modern architecture, but were rather intricate, multi-paned assemblies of hand-blown crown glass that possessed a distinct physical presence and a unique, almost liquid quality. The manufacturing of this glass was a labor-intensive and highly skilled craft, involving the blowing of a massive globe of molten silicate which was then rapidly spun into a flat, circular disc, a process that inevitably left a series of concentric ripples, subtle waves, and tiny, trapped air bubbles known as seeds within the cooling material. When these discs were cut into small, rectangular panes for the window sashes, each individual piece of glass retained its own optical personality, creating a subtle distortion of the landscape beyond that made the trees and the distant hills appear to shimmer and shift as the observer moved across the room. This distortion gave the world outside a dreamlike, ethereal quality, as if one were viewing the landscape through the depths of a still, clear pool of water. In the center of the original glass disc resided the bullseye, a thick, swirling knot of glass where the blowpipe had been attached, which was often relegated to the less prominent windows, adding a rustic, textured focal point to the shadows. The window frames themselves were crafted from slender sections of seasoned timber, usually pine or oak, painted in muted, earthy tones such as deep lead gray or a somber ochre to harmonize with the surrounding masonry. These sashes were often divided into 6/6 configurations, held together by delicate wooden muntins that cast thin, geometric shadows across the interior floorboards as the moon traveled through the sky. The mechanical operation of the windows was a tactile experience, the heavy wooden sashes sliding within deep, waxed channels, requiring a significant physical effort to lift and secure with a simple iron pin or a heavy cast brass sash lock. During the deep, silent hours of the night, the windows became the primary source of illumination, allowing the pale, cool light of the moon to filter into the darkened rooms. This moonlight was transformed by the ripples of the crown glass, painting the textured walls with elongated, distorted patterns that moved with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. The air near the glass was always cooler than the rest of the room, a consequence of the minimal insulating properties of the thin panes, and in the winter months, this temperature differential created a canvas for the growth of crystalline frost patterns that crept across the interior surface like silver ferns. These frost formations served as a natural, ephemeral screen, further isolating the household from the freezing world outside while creating a stunning visual display in the blue midnight shadows. The scent of the window area was a mixture of the cold, metallic tang of the glass and the woody aroma of the painted frames. In the silence of the night, the windows were the ears of the house, transmitting the muffled sounds of the wind or the distant, hollow clatter of a passing carriage on the cobblestones. each sound filtered through the dense medium of the glass and the heavy timber frame, adding a subtle, percussive layer to the auditory atmosphere. To manage the intrusion of cold, every window was equipped with internal shutters made of solid wood, or thick, floor-to-ceiling draperies, which, when closed, created a profound sense of enclosure and security, turning the room into a dark, silent cocoon. The relationship between the inhabitant and the window was one of constant, quiet negotiation, a source of light that also demanded vigilant care to prevent the entry of drafts or the loss of precious heat from the hearth. As the moon reached its zenith and cast its most intense indigo light, the crown glass seemed to glow from within, its ripples catching the celestial rays and scattering them in tiny, starlit directions, creating a sanctuary of light and shadow that anchored the family to the cosmic rhythms. The weight of the frame, the coolness of the glass, and the distortion of the view all combined to create a sensory experience that was both rugged and deeply beautiful. As the household drifted into sleep, the windows stood as silent sentinels, their rippled panes reflecting the stars and holding the quiet, enduring world of the past in a fragile, luminous embrace. The air near the floor remained still, holding the ghost of the day's warmth, while the glass grew colder, creating a vertical world of temperature that dictated the nocturnal geography. The windows were the eyes of the home, gazing out into the absolute darkness of the night, providing a silent testament to the enduring bond between the human spirit and the natural light. Every pane of glass, with its unique ripples, was a window into a time when the world was seen through a softer, more organic lens, where the boundary between inside and outside was marked by the delicate, handcrafted artistry of the 1820s glassblower. As the moon traveled lower in the sky, the light shifted through the glass, illuminating different textures of the plaster walls and revealing the dust motes dancing in the cold, still air. It was a place of deep indigo peace, where the only movement was the slow, lazy drift of a stray shadow, and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of the wind against the panes. The glass remained cold to the touch, a silent reminder of the distance between the warm heart of the home and the infinite cold of the night, providing a sense of security and continuity that is almost entirely lost in the modern world of perfect, sterile transparency. As the candle was extinguished, the window became the sole anchor to reality, a fragile, glowing portal in the heart of the silent house. The horizontal plane of an 1820s dwelling, the foundational stratum upon which daily life was enacted and the quietude of the night was anchored, possessed a profound tactile identity that defined the sensory experience of the home. These floors were not the sterile, uniform surfaces of the modern era, but were composed of massive white planks of hard pine or oak, often 12 to 18 inches in width, a testament to the old-growth forests that provided the timber. These planks were never perfectly flat, bearing the subtle, undulating ridges left by the hand plane and the occasional deep knot secured directly to the massive floor joists with heavy, hand-forged iron nails, whose flat heads would eventually wear flush with the wood, or sometimes pop up, catching a stray stocking or the edge of a slipper. The feeling of walking upon these floors in the deep stillness of the midnight hour, illuminated only by the pale, cool light of the moon filtering through rippled crown glass, was an intimate connection to the very structure of the building. The wood felt cool, dry, and slightly velvety underfoot, its surface smoothed by generations of friction and the repetitive, meditative application of linseed oil and beeswax, creating a deep, amber patina that seemed to hold the warmth of the day's sun long into the cold, indigo hours of the night. As one moved across the chamber, the floor would offer its own nocturnal language, a slow, resonant creak as a plank settled under weight, a subtle groan from a flexing nail, or the soft, rhythmic shush of a foot sliding over the polished surface. In the grander rooms, such as the formal parlor or the best bedroom, this raw wood was often obscured by imported carpets. Massive expanses of woven wool featuring intricate neoclassical designs or vibrant floral patterns in deep blues, greens, and madder reds. These carpets were prized possessions, signaling wealth and sophistication, and their dense, coarse pile offered a comforting insulation against the rising damp and the drafts that crept through the thresholds. Walking upon them felt muffled, a soft, sinking sensation that silenced the natural sounds of the house, creating an atmosphere of profound quiet and enclosed luxury. Yet for the majority of the domestic spaces, the floors remained bare or were covered by simpler, locally woven textiles. In the hallways and family sitting rooms, one might find long runners woven from strips of salvage cloth, known as rag rugs, their chaotic patterns of indigo, brown, and gray adding texture to the shadows, or perhaps durable mats woven from jute, sisal, or rushes, which felt coarse and abrasive against a bare foot. A tactile reminder of utility and labor. These natural fibers carried a dry, earthy scent that mingled with the aroma of the wax and the wood smoke, adding another layer to the complex sensory map of the 1820s home. In the service areas, the kitchen and the larder, the floors transitioned to a functional hardness. Massive flagstones of local limestone or slate, or tightly packed bricks laid directly onto the earth, these surfaces were perpetually cold, a deep, bone-deep chill that could be felt even through thick leather soles, often slick with condensation or the residues of lye and sand used for scrubbing, their uneven textures catching the faint moonlight and casting a grid of shallow, dark shadows. The stillness of the house at midnight settled most heavily upon the floors, the lowest stratum of the domestic landscape, where the dust motes, illuminated in the shafts of moonlight, would dance and slowly fall to join the microhistory trapped within the cracks between the white planks. Every wear mark, every scratch from a moved table, every stain from a dropped candle was a silent record of daily life, a physical accumulation of time that was felt in the variation of the wood grain beneath the hand or foot. As the hours stretched toward dawn, the vertical climate of the home became evident, the air near the ceiling remaining slightly warmer, holding the ghost of the evening's warmth, while the floors grew colder and colder, creating a nocturnal geography where the most desirable locations were furthest from the drafts that swept across the polished white planks. The relationship between the inhabitant and the floor was one of mutual endurance, a cold tactile bond that defined the physical reality of the 1820s life. Every step a confirmation of place and presence in a world of silence and shadow. The staircase in an 1820s dwelling was far more than a simple functional element connecting the living floors. It was the central vertical axis around which the house was constructed, a massive architectural spine composed entirely of seasoned timber, chosen for strength and resilience against constant use. In this era, construction methods relied heavily on precise joinery rather than the metal fasteners of the future. The treads were often made of thick planks of hardwoods, such as oak or maple, to withstand decades of wear, while the risers and structural carriages were fashioned from resilient pine. These components were fitted together using a system of mortise and tenon joints, secured with wooden pegs and tight friction, a methodology that inherently allowed for microscopic movements as the wood responded to the changing ambient humidity and temperature of the unheated holes. This organic quality meant that every staircase possessed its own unique vocal identity, a complex language of creaks, groans, and resonant snaps that defined the auditory landscape of the home, especially during the profound stillness of the midnight hours. Walking upon these stairs in the darkness, illuminated only by the cool blue light of the moon filtering through a hallway window, was an acoustic ritual that instantly broadcasted one's position to the entire sleeping household, Every thread offered a different note in this symphony of structural wear: the low, deep moan of the fifth step, the sharp, sudden crack of the ninth, or the soft rhythmic shush of a woolen stocking sliding over the polished patina of the wood. Generations of passage had left their mark upon the stairs, creating a distinct physical record of life. A shallow depression worn into the center of each tread. A tactile valley that could be felt distinctly under the sole of the foot. This wear smoothed the grain of the wood into a dark, velvety sheen, a patina that caught the rare glints of pale moonlights and held the accumulated history of countless domestic journeys. The scent of the stairwell was always distinct, a concentration of the home's olfactory map. Heavy with the aroma of beeswax polish, linseed oil, and the faint, dry dust that settled inevitably in the enclosed passage. A smell that intensified in the dead of winter when the house was sealed tight against the freezing air. In the deepest hours of the night, as the house cooled and settled on its foundations, the stairs would continue to speak. A phantom footfall caused by the release of tension in a flexing plank or the contraction of a timber peg. These random sounds formed a quiet, percussive backdrop to the silence, a reminder of the living nature of the materials that provided the shelter. The banister was another crucial point of contact. A smooth, continuous length of polished mahogany or walnut that guided the hand through the darkness, its surface feeling cool, smooth, and infinitely comforting, anchored by a massive, hand-carved newel post at the base, a structural and symbolic weight that grounded the vertical ascent. The balusters supporting the rail formed a rhythmic pattern of slender shadow, painting the surrounding walls with distorted, geometric shapes that shifted slowly with the movement of the moon. The staircase was a liminal zone, a passage of transition between the public spaces of the ground floor and the private sanctuary of the upper chambers, a realm of shadow and sound that anchored the domestic experience in a world of silence and deep, indigo peace. Every creak a confirmation of structure, every groan a testament to endurance, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house. The master bedroom of the 1820s was a sanctuary constructed not just of architecture, but of fabric and profound isolation. A space defined by its sensory and social separation from the rest of the domestic sphere. Crossing the threshold from the cooler, noisier hallways into this chamber in the deep stillness of the midnight hour. The occupant was immediately struck by a sensation of heavy enclosure and absolute privacy. The focal point of this room was the massive four-poster bed, often crafted from dark mahogany or walnut, rising like a fortress within the fortress of the home. It was surrounded by heavy, floor-to-ceiling draperies made of dense wool, velvet, or patterned chintz. These curtains served a vital thermal and psychological purpose. When drawn tight against the drafts, they created a sealed cocoon of warmth, trapping the heat generated by the occupants' bodies and preventing the escape of precious warmth into the large, high-ceilinged room. This enclosure meant that the air within the bed was often warmer, stiller, and possessed a different olfactory identity than the rest of the chamber. A private atmosphere heavy with the scents of laundry soap, body warmth, and the faint, comforting odor of goose or duck feathers from the thick mattress and pillows. The bedding itself offered a complex tactile experience, a far cry from the synthetic smoothness of the future. The sheets were made of coarse, hand-woven flax linen, which felt cool and rough against the skin initially, before slowly warming with body heat. Above these lay several heavy blankets of unspun wool, their texture fibrous and substantial, topped by a decorative quilt filled with lamb's wool or cotton batting, creating a heavy, weighted pressure that signaled rest and security. Beyond the immediate sanctuary of the bed, the master bedroom in the 1820s was enveloped in deep indigo shadow, illuminated only by the pale, cool light of the moon filtering through rippled crown-glass windows. This light was sparse, casting elongated geometric patterns of the wide plank floorboards, which often felt bare and chilly to the touch, demanding the use of woven mats or bedside carpets made of jute or wool to provide a brief buffer against the rising cold. The scent of the room was a subtle blend of lavender sachets kept within the dark wooden drawers of the chest of drawers, and the lingering aroma of the beeswax used to maintain the high sheen of the mahogany wardrobe and the serpentine-fronted bureau. A faint, dry smell of wood smoke might also hang in the air from a small, banked fire in the hearth, its embers glowing dim red, casting soft, pulsing light that was too weak to illuminate, only adding depth to the profound gloom of the room. This room was the absolute domain of privacy, a concept fiercely guarded in an era where families often slept in close proximity. Here, behind thick doors and heavy curtains, the silence was absolute. A heavy, velvety blanket that muffled the sounds of the natural world outside and the workings of the house, creating a profound indigo peace that enveloped the spirit and allowed for deep, restorative sleep. Every object, from the cold brass handles of the drawers to the soft wool of the blankets, was chosen for endurance and functional comfort. Anchoring the 1820s home in a world of silence and shadow, the relationship between the inhabitant and his private chamber was one of mutual endurance and protection, a cold, tactile bond that defined the physical reality of the early 19th century life. Section 16. Yatak Vetextil Urneri. The textile landscape of an 1820s bedchamber was an intricate, multi-layered sanctuary of natural fibers designed to provide a fortress of warmth and comfort within the unheated, stone-walled structures of the era. This was a domain where the sensory experience of rest was defined by the profound weight and the distinct textures of materials harvested directly from the earth and the livestock of the surrounding countryside. The foundational layer of the sleeping experience began with the mattress, which was rarely a single unit, but rather a series of specialized sacks known as tickings, constructed from heavy hand-woven linen or durable cotton canvas. The lowermost ticking was typically filled with the coarse, dried husks of corn, rye straw, or even wood shavings, creating a firm, supportive base that emitted the dry, rhythmic rustling sound with every movement of the sleeper, a percussive reminder of the seasonal harvest. Above this structural layer sat the true luxury of the 19th century home, the feather bed, a voluminous and cloud-like cushion filled with several pounds of goose or duck down. The secondary mattress was designed to envelop the body in a deep, insulating pocket, allowing the inhabitant to sink into a soft, heat-trapping abyss that provided an essential barrier against the biting chill of the midnight air. The maintenance of this feather bed was a daily ritual of intense physical labor, requiring a vigorous beating and shaking to redistribute the down and restore its loft, a task that released a faint, powdery dust into the still, sun-moted air of the morning. The linens that came into direct contact with the skin were a far cry from the synthetic smoothness of later centuries. They were fashioned from hand-spun flax, a material that possessed a significant structural weight and a slightly abrasive, cooling texture that felt crisp and honest against the skin. These sheets were laundered with harsh lye soaps and dried in the open air, resulting in a clean, ozone-like scent that was often augmented by small silk sachets of dried lavender or mint tucked into the wooden linen presses. The true engineering of warmth, however, was found in the layers of blankets that were added as the seasons turned toward the freezing depths of winter. These were made of thick, unspun wool, their fibers dense and slightly oily to the touch, providing a heavy, non-breathable layer that anchored the sleeper to the bed and prevented the escape of precious body heat. The crowning element of the bed was often the quilt, a masterpiece of domestic patience and community, composed of hundreds of scraps of salvage fabric, chintz, dats, calico, and silk, stitched together in complex geometric patterns. The padding of these quilts, made of raw cotton or lamb's wool batting, added a final, weighted pressure that signaled the transition into deep, restorative rest. The tactile topography of the quilt, with its thousands of tiny, hand-sewn stitches, could be felt by a hand moving across the surface in the profound darkness of the room, creating a map of history and labor. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, when the only light was the pale, blue glow of the moon filtering through rippled crown glass, the bed stood as a dark, silent monument to domestic security. The olfactory identity of the bedding was a comforting blend of old wood, laundry soap, and the faint, animal aroma of the feathers, a scent that intensified as the interior of the bed warmed with the presence of the sleeper. The contrast between the sharp, freezing air of the chamber and the humid, wool-bound warmth of the bed was the defining physical reality of the nocturnal experience, a private ecosystem where the modern world of the 1820s vanished, replaced by the elemental comforts of stone, wood, and fiber. Every blanket, every sheet, and every stitch was a testament to a world where objects were made to last for generations, their textures recording the passage of time and the history of the household. As the sleeper drifted towards sleep, the weight of the wool and the softness of the down created a profound sense of enclosure, a sanctuary of indigo peace that allowed the spirit to retreat from the labors of the day and find refuge in the absolute silence of the night. The relationship between the human body and these natural textiles was one of intimate dependence, a nightly negotiation with the cold that was settled through the careful arrangement of the heavy, honest materials of the earth. As the moon reached its zenith, the textures of the linen and the grain of the bedpost were revealed in the cool, ethereal light. A silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house. The act of morning purification in an 1820s bedchamber was a visceral and bracing encounter with the immediate geography of the domestic unheated environment, serving as the definitive ritual that broke the nocturnal seal and prepared the body for the disciplined labors of the day. This was an era before the concept of plumbed, pressurized hot water, where cleanliness was a localized, laborious, and sensory-intense negotiation with the elements, conducted entirely within the private confines of the sleeping room. The physical apparatus for this ceremony was the washstand, a delicate piece of furniture typically crafted from mahogany or painted pine, featuring a circular cutout in its top surface to securely hold the washing basin. Above this sat the ewer, a substantial ceramic pitcher filled the night before with water drawn from the backyard pump, and perhaps a smaller, lidded jar for fresh water for rinsing. This water, having rested in the unheated chamber throughout the deep, frozen hours of the midnight, was perpetually bone-deep cold, often carrying a thin, fragile skim of ice across its surface that had to be shattered with the knuckles before the ritual could begin. The sensation of this water on the skin was an abrupt and all-consuming shock, a freezing, stimulating intrusion that instantly banished the lingering warmth of the feather bed and sent a shiver through the frame structure of the body. The primary cleaning agent was a simple block of hard soap, often rendered from animal fat and lye, its scent stark, functional, and occasionally scented with lavender or rosemary, which felt harsh, slippery, and slightly abrasive against the skin, creating a thin, latherless film that required vigorous scrubbing with a square of coarse, hand-woven flax linen. This washcloth possessed a significant textural weight, its fibers scrubbing the pores and stimulating circulation while absorbing the cold moisture. The visual landscape of the washstand at dawn was a study in soft, gray light and deep, Indigo shadows, the pale, cool rays of the rising sun filtering through rippled crown glass windows, painting distorted geometric patterns across the ceramic glaze and illuminating the mist of breath vapor that rose from the basin. The sounds of the ritual were few, dominated by the muffled splash of water against the earthenware, the rhythmic scrub of the linen, and the sharp, metallic click of the brass or ceramic stopper as it settled into place. The smell of the room was a complex layers of the lingering wood smoke from the banked hearth, the acrid scent of the extinguished tallow candle, and the clean, sharp aroma of the soap, making the air feel raw and substantial. Every movement was deliberate and rapid, a race against the encroaching cold of the chamber, culminating in the use of the towel, a heavy expanse of huckaback linen or coarse cotton, which felt thick, absorbing, and rough against the wet skin, restoring warmth through friction and erasing the last traces of the night. This was a utilitarian, no-nonsense relationship with cleanliness, devoid of the luxurious soak of the future. A moment where the modern world of the 1820s collided with the ancient, elemental forces of water, cold and stone. As the ritual concluded, the water in the basin turned cloudy, a physical record of the night's impurities, a silent testament to the body's daily resurrection in a world of silence and shadow. The physical maintenance of a wardrobe in the early 19th century was an exhaustive, multi-day cycle of manual labor that dictated the sensory atmosphere of the service areas and the tactile reality of the garments themselves. Every piece of clothing, whether the coarse linen shift of a laborer or the delicate muslin gown of a lady, required a specialized and rigorous sequence of purification and preservation that anchored the household to the rhythmic seasons of cleanliness. The process began with the heavy physical exertion of the wash day, often conducted in a damp, stone-floored laundry room or the corner of the kitchen, where massive copper kettles were filled with water and heated over a roaring fire until the air was thick with a humid, white steam that carried the sharp, acrid scent of lye soap rendered from wood ash and animal fat. This smell was the definitive aroma of cleanliness in the 1820s. A pungent and medicinal fragrance that permeated the lath plaster walls and the heavy timber beams. The garments were agitated in this boiling water using heavy wooden paddles and rubbed against corrugated washboards, a repetitive, percussive sound that echoed through the quiet house. The texture of the fabrics changed dramatically during this process, the once soft cottons and linens becoming heavy, sodden, and unyielding as they absorbed the water and the soap. Following the wash, the items were rinsed in cold, mineral-rich water and moved to the specialized task of starching, a process that utilized a thick, opaque liquid made from boiled wheat or potato starch. This substance was meticulously worked into the fibers of collars, cuffs, and shirt fronts to provide a structural rigidity and a smooth, soil-resistant finish that was essential for maintaining a respectable appearance. The starch felt tacky and cool to the touch, and as it dried, it transformed the fabric into a stiff, parchment-like material that crackled with a dried, rhythmic sound as it was handled. The final and most dangerous stage of the cycle was the ironing, which required the use of heavy, solid cast iron tools known as sad irons. These implements, weighing anywhere from 5 to 10 pounds, were heated directly on the hearth or a dedicated iron heater, their surfaces becoming searingly hot and susceptible to soot from the fire. To prevent staining the clean laundry, the iron had to be meticulously wiped before being pressed onto the damp fabric, a ritual often tested by a single drop of water that would sizzle and dance across the hot metal. The act of ironing was an olfactory experience of its own. As the intense heat met the starched linen, it released a distinct, scorched scent, a warm, dry aroma that signaled the completion of the labor. The sound of the iron gliding over the boards was a smooth, rhythmic hiss, punctuated by the metallic clink as the iron was returned to the fire to reheat. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, the laundry room or kitchen became a sanctuary of drying fabrics. The long, white shirts and heavy petticoats hanging from wooden racks or drying horses, their forms catching the pale, blue moonlight filtering through the small, rippled crown glass windows. These drying garments cast long, spectral shadows against the textured walls, their dampness adding a cool, humid weight to the still air. The scent of the room was a complex blend of the lingering lye, the sweet smell of the starch, and the earthy aroma of the wood smoke, creating a sense of profound odor and domestic discipline. The transition from the wet, chaotic state of the wash to the crisp, pressed reality of the finished garment was a physical manifestation of the honed stability. Every crease, every fold, and every stiffened collar was a testament to hours of vigilant care. As the household slept, the laundry settled into a cold, starlit peace. The fabrics slowly surrendering their moisture to the night air, leaving only the faint, clean fragrance of the earth and the memory of the day's fire. The relationship between the inhabitant and their clothing was one of intimate, tactile dependence, a world where the very feel of the fabric against the skin was a record of the labor required to maintain it. Every garment held a history of the hands that scrubbed, starched, and pressed it, a sanctuary of indigo peace in the heart of the silent house. The heavy woolens, though not washed as frequently, carried their own scent of lanolin and damp earth, hanging in the shadows of the wardrobes like silent, textured sentinels of the past. As the moon traveled across the sky, the textures of the linen and the grain of the drying racks were revealed in the cool, ethereal light, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house, where the only movement was the slow, lazy drift of a stray shadow and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of the wind against the house. The laundry was a testament to the endurance of the domestic sphere, a quiet, lingering record of the meticulous care required to maintain life in an age of profound silence. The child's room, or nursery, of the 1820s was a sanctuary constructed not of excessive ornamentation or abundant playthings, but of profound simplicity and utilitarian comfort, a space designed to instill early habits of order and restraint in a world defined by its tactile realities and deep silence. Walking into this room in the deep stillness of the midnight hour, one was immediately struck by the raw honesty of the materials that formed the domestic landscape. The walls were often covered in a practical, non-reflective lime wash in soft shades of gray or pale blue, possessing a powdery, matte texture that absorbed the dim light and added a layer of visual softness to the enshrouding gloom. The floorboards were made of white planks of pine or oak, worn smooth and uneven by generations of small restless feet, and rarely covered by more than a simple, braided rag rug to catch the worst of the drafts. In the blue moonlight filtering through the small, rippled panes of crown glass, the room presented a geometry of shadow and form, the focal point being the sleeping area, which varied significantly according to age and family wealth. For the youngest, a cradle carved from solid oak stood near the hearth, its rockers worn smooth against the floor, holding within its depths a small ticking mattress filled with dry corn husks or straw that rustled softly with every breath, covered by a heavy wool blanket woven in a simple check pattern. As children grew, they moved into small, low bedsteads, often without posts or curtains, piled high with ticking and heavy wool to provide the necessary warmth in the unheated chamber. The air in the room was always cooler than the downstairs parlors, carrying a faint condensation and the dry, pervasive scent of seasoned wood, dust, and perhaps a sachet of dried lavender or mint tucked beneath the small, straw-filled pillow to ward off pests. The olfactory identity of the 20s nursery was a comforting blend of these natural aromas mingled with the distinct smell of wood smoke seeping from the chimneys, a scent that intensified in the winter months when the house was sealed tight against the freezing air. Playthings were scarce and treasured, simple objects crafted by hand from wood, bone, or salvaged cloth. A jointed wooden soldier with chipped paint, a soft rag doll stuffed with unspun wool, a heavy marble or two, these items rested on a simple shelf or inside a dark pine chest, their forms barely visible in the deep, indigo shadows carrying the rich textures of wear and tactile affection. The sounds of the nursery at night were few, but each possessed a sharp clarity in the absolute quiet. The soft, rhythmic breathing of a child, the sudden, metallic snap of the house contracting in the cold, the distant, hollow hoot of an owl, or the slow, comforting tick of a small brass lantern clock positioned on a chest, measuring the silent passage of time. Lighting was minimal. A single, unlit tallow candle in a simple tin holder sat on the bureau. Ready for emergencies, its acrid scent lingering from previous uses, the room was the absolute domain of domestic peace and enclosed security, a space where the noise of the external 18th century world could not penetrate. Every object was functional, every texture was honest, and every sound was grounded in the immediate reality of life. As the moon traveled across the sky, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the still air, it revealed the intricate textures of the woven fibers and the deep grain of the wood, a silent testament to the quiet, enduring beauty of the 20s childhood. It was a world where the darkness was not feared, but welcomed as a natural conclusion to the day's discipline. A soft, blue-tinted envelope that signaled the time for deep, restorative rest in the heart of the silent house. The relationship between the child and their room was one of humble, tactile dependence, a nightly negotiation with the cold that was settled through the careful arrangement of the heavy, honest materials of the earth. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense indigo light, the textures of the wool and the grain of the wood were revealed in the cool, ethereal light, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house. The servant quarters of the 1820s were a world apart from the polished mahogany and velvet of the main house, representing the invisible, utilitarian engine that allowed the grand domestic ritual to function without pause. These areas were strategically located in the least desirable parts of the structure, squeezed beneath the rafters in the suffocatingly hot or freezing cold attics, or buried in the damp, sunless basements adjacent to the kitchen and laundry. A servant's bedroom in this era was defined by profound austerity and shared confinement, often housing multiple individuals in a space barely large enough for a single occupant in the upper floors. The visual landscape of these chambers at midnight was one of near total darkness, illuminated only by the cheapest, smelliest form of artificial light, a single, sputtering tallow candle made from rendered mutton fat, which emitted an acrid, smoky stench that clung to the low ceilings and the flaking whitewash walls. These candles burned quickly and unevenly, casting erratic, weak shadows that failed to reach the corners of the room, leaving them enveloped in a permanent, heavy gloom. The furniture was strictly functional and stripped of any decorative flourish. The beds were often simple, low wooden frames holding ticking mattresses stuffed with coarse straw or corn husks, which rustled loudly with every movement, a sharp, dry sound that punctuated the thick silence of the night. The bedding consisted of thin blankets made of low-grade wool, offering scant protection against the drafts that freely penetrated the poorly insulated attic walls or the rising damp from the basement flagstones. The air in these quarters was perpetually still and heavy, saturated with the collective olfactory history of intense physical labor, a complex and unchanging aroma of stale sweat, damp wool uniforms, cheap lye soap, and the faint, persistent smell of cooking grease sipping up from the kitchens below. Ventilation was practically non-existent, with small, ill-fitting windows often kept tightly sealed to preserve whatever meager warmth might be found, leading to a vertical stratification of climate that made the upper floor stifling in the summer months. The auditory environment of the servant areas was characterized by the sounds of necessity and fatigue, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of exhausted bodies, the sharp creak of cheap pine floorboards, or the distant, jarring clang of the house bell system, a constant, mechanical reminder of the required obedience, even in the deepest hours of the night. The servant's sleep was never truly secure, conditioned by the early morning requirements of the household, demanding they rise before dawn in the profound darkness and freezing cold to begin the daily cycle of firelighting and cleaning. The textures of this world were rough and unyielding, the flaking whitewash leaving a dusty residue on the hand, the coarse wool of the blankets prickly against the skin, and the cold, uneven flagstones of the basement hallways biting through thin-soled shoes. This was a parallel reality existing within the same walls, defined by sacrifice, endurance, and the constant suppression of individual comfort for the collective functioning of the domestic machine. Every scratched surface, every worn step in the back staircase, and every patched garment was a silent record of the labor required to maintain the 1820s home. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, these areas stood as dark, silent sentinels of service, where the only movement was the slow, lazy drift of a stray shadow, and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of a weary body surrendering to a few brief hours of rest in the heart of the enclosed house. The relationship between the servant and their environment was one of humble, utilitarian dependence, a nightly negotiation with the cold that was settled through the careful arrangement of the heavy, honest materials of the earth. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense indigo light, the textures of the straw and the grain of the wood were revealed in the cool, ethereal light, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house. The vertical ascent to the highest reaches of the 1820s home culminated in the attic, a space defined by its profound separation from the active life below, a static repository of memory and history perched beneath the complex network of massive, hand-hewn timber rafters that formed the very skeleton of the house. Entering this chamber in the deep stillness of the midnight hour, the immediate sensation was one of enclosed quietude, a silence that felt thick, dusty, and saturated with the unique olfactory map of time, a complex aroma composed of decomposed paper, drying flax, old leather bindings, and the distinct resinous scent of the centuries-old oak and pine beams that dominated the visual structure. These massive timbers, often dark with age and soot, carried the visible marks of the adze and the saw, catching the rare glints of pale, cool moonlight filtering through a solitary, small skylight or a high-set, multi-paned window. This light transformed the space into a realm of deep indigo and charcoal blue shadows, where the past seemed tangible and the active world was a distant, impossible thought. The visual landscape of the attic was a study in controlled decay and forgotten utility, a sanctuary for the outmoded and the treasured, massive wooden chests, bound with hand-forged iron straps and locked with heavy brass mechanisms, stood like ancient sentinels along the rough planked walls, their interiors heavy with the scent of lavender sachets and moth-eaten wool, holding outdated clothing from previous generations, perhaps a silk waistcoat from the 1790s or a heavy wool uniform, its buttons dulled with oxidation. Alongside them rested silent tools of labor, a spinning wheel, its rhythmic clatter stilled for decades, its delicate wheel catching a stray ray of starlight, outdated furniture, too worn for the public parlors but too valuable to discard. a broken-backed chair, a wobbly table to discard, a broken-backed chair, a wobbly table, their mahogany or cherrywood surfaces obscured by a fine layer of gray dust, piles of old books and family papers, their ink faded to a faint brown, their pages brittle and yellowed, holding the unvoiced thoughts and domestic records of a simpler time, a box of children's toys, a carved wooden soldier, a rag doll, their forms barely discernible in the deep shadows, carrying the tactile record of a forgotten childhood. The attic was a liminal zone, a repository of memory that stood as a silent sentinel over the active life of the floors below. The silence here was different. A profound, heavy quietude that muffled the sounds of the natural world outside and the workings of the house, creating a sanctuary where the only reality was the physical structure and the weight of the accumulated objects. In the deepest hours of the night, as the house settled on its foundations, the attic remained still, a silent witness to the passage of time, a world of shadow, dust, and memory that anchored the home to its historical context, providing a sense of security and continuity. As the moon traveled across the sky, the textures of the timber, the grain of the wood, and the form of the forgotten objects were revealed in the cool, ethereal light, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house. The descent into the lowest stratum of the 1820s home represented a transition into a realm of absolute thermal stability and profound, unyielding silence. This was the cellar, the subterranean foundation that anchored the domestic structure to the cold, dark heart of the earth itself, carved directly into the soil and lined with massive, unpolished fieldstones, or heavy, hard-fired bricks that remained perpetually damp and cool, regardless of the heat that might be radiating from the hearths far above. Entering this space in the middle of the night, one was immediately enveloped in an air that felt liquid and heavy, several degrees colder than the hallways, carrying a distinct olfactory map of the hidden world. A thick aroma composed of wet stone, dormant earth, and the sharp, metallic tang of iron-bound barrels. This was the sanctuary of the long-term harvest, where the survival of the family was measured in the density of its stone beams and the meticulous arrangement of its ceramic rocks. The visual landscape of the 1820 cellar at midnight was a study in absolute indigo and charcoal blue shadows, illuminated only by the pale, ethereal light of the moon filtering through a tiny, barred window at ground level. This light was weak and diffused, barely catching the damp sheen of the masonry walls and painting distorted, geometric patterns across the irregular flagstone floor, which felt bone-deep cold and slightly slick underfoot, providing a natural refrigeration system that relied on the thermal mass of the surrounding soil. In the deep corners, massive wooden bins held the root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and heavy, soil-encrusted potatoes buried in dry, coarse sand to mimic the cool, dark environment of the garden. The sand felt gritty and abrasive, falling through the fingers with the soft, shushing sound that was the only noise in the room. Alongside these bins, the shelves of slate or limestone were packed with the results of the summer's pickling, jars of cucumbers, onions, and hard-boiled eggs suspended in a sharp, amber brine. The ceramic vessels themselves were works of utilitarian art, their salt-glazed surfaces featuring deep, cobalt blue decorations that seemed to pulse with life in the dim, starlit air. Further back in the darkness, the beverage cellar held the family's supply of cider, ale, and perhaps a few precious bottles of wine, stored in heavy, oak barrels that were bound with cold iron hoops. The scent here was richer, a blend of fermented fruit, seasoned timber, and the faint, sweet smell of the beeswax used to seal the bungs. The silence was absolute. a heavy, velvet blanket that muffled the sounds of the house and the natural world, creating a sanctuary where the only reality was the physical structure and the preservation of life. The darkness was a tool of preservation, protecting the delicate oils and vitamins in the food from the degrading effects of sunlight. The ceiling was a forest of its own, draped with heavy, braided ropes of onions and garlic that cast long, bulbous shadows against the whitewashed walls. These vegetables were dry and papery, their skins rustling like dead leaves in the slight drafts that moved through the room. The coldness of the cellar was not merely a physical temperature, but a psychological state, a feeling of profound isolation and readiness. It was the most honest room in the house, a place where the connection between the land and the table was visible in every shadow. The air near the floor was the coldest, a pocket of dense, heavy oxygen that seemed to freeze the very movement of time, while the air near the rafters carried the lingering, sweet warmth of the drying herbs. This vertical climate was a carefully managed ecosystem. The moon, casting its pale, blue light through the iron bars, painted a grid of shadows across the stone floor, a celestial clock that marked the slow, silent progress of the night. It was a place of deep, indigo peace. The weight of the jars, the roughness of the sand, and the coldness of the stone all combined to create a sensory experience that was both rugged and deeply comforting, providing a sense of security and continuity. As the household slept, the cellar stood as a silent sentinel, its contents a promise of survival against the freezing nights. It was a space where the past and future were bound together in a single, dark chamber of stone and wood. The management of human waste and the maintenance of personal hygiene in the 1820s represented one of the most stark and visceral realities of domestic life. A world entirely devoid of the invisible and pressurized sewage systems of the future, where the biological necessities of existence were handled with a combination of heavy ceramic vessels and labor-intensive manual removal, as well as a constant and unspoken negotiation with the encroaching sense of the subterranean world. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, the sensory landscape of a high-status home was defined by the presence of the chamber pot, a substantial and lidded vessel typically made of heavy salt-glazed stoneware or fine creamware, often decorated with delicate blue floral patterns that masked its utilitarian and grim purpose. These vessels were kept beneath the bed or inside a specialized wooden cabinet known as a commode, which featured a marble top and a heavy door to contain the odors of the night. The physical act of using these items in the freezing and unheated air of the chamber was a bracing and intimate encounter with the cold stone or ceramic surface, which felt bone-deep chilly against the skin, creating a sharp contrast with the lingering warmth of the feather bed. The olfactory identity of the 1820s bedroom was inevitably influenced by these vessels. A complex and heavy aroma of stagnant water and lye soap, and the faint but persistent tang of waste that even the most meticulous cleaning could not entirely erase. Every morning, the contents of these pots were gathered by the domestic staff in a ritual of profound labor and social hierarchy. Carried in heavy lead-lined buckets down the narrow and creaking back staircases to the backyard, where they were deposited into a deep and masonry-lined pit known as a cesspool. This structure was the dark and silent anchor of the home's waste management. A subterranean chamber that relied on the slow and natural filtration of the soil and the periodic but necessary visits of the night soil men. These individuals arrived in the absolute darkness of the late hours, their heavy horse-drawn carts rattling on the cobblestones to manually empty the pits and carry the waste away to the outskirts of the city. The air in the backyard during these hours was thick and suffocating, a dense fog of organic decay and damp earth that seeped through the ill-fitting window frames and hung low over the ground. Inside the home, the concept of the bathroom did not exist. Instead, personal washing was conducted at the washstand using cold water and harsh soaps. While the more significant needs were met by the privy, a small and unheated timber structure located at the far end of the garden or yard, walking to this structure in the middle of the night was an exercise in endurance. The path illuminated only by the pale and cool light of the moon. The interior of the privy was a study in profound simplicity and coldness. Featuring a simple wooden bench with a circular opening over the dark void below, the air was sharp and carrying the sense of lime used to suppress the odors and the dry and papery rustle of old newspapers or discarded rags used for cleaning. The silence of the yard at midnight was absolute, punctuated only by the distant and rhythmic clank of the night soil cart or the sudden and metallic snap of the house contracting in the cold. Every object associated with sanitization, from the heavy ceramic ewer to the cold iron handle of the pump, was a testament to a world where cleanliness required constant and vigilant physical effort. The relationship between the inhabitant and their waste was one of immediate and tactile reality, a constant reminder of the physical limitations of the human body and the raw materials of the earth. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense and indigo light, the textures of the stoneware and the grain of the wooden commodes were revealed in the cool and ethereal light, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house, providing a sense of security and continuity that is almost entirely lost in the modern era of automated waste removal. The weight of the ceramic and the roughness of the lime and the sharpness of the cold air and the heavy and velvet silence of the night all combined to create a sensory experience that was both rugged and deeply honest, anchoring the 1820s family to the enduring laws of nature and the rhythmic cycles of the earth. As the household slept, the sanitation systems of the past stood as silent sentinels, their forms a promise of the morning's return. The management of heat in the 1820s home was a constant and relentless struggle against the invasive cold of the northern winters, a physical and psychological negotiation with the elemental forces of fire and stone that dictated the very survival of the household. This was an era before the luxury of central, invisible heating, where warmth was a localized, fragile, and highly labor-intensive commodity that required the vigilant attention of every inhabitant. The primary source of heat was the open hearth, a massive masonry structure that anchored the home and served as its thermal heart. But these fireplaces were notoriously inefficient, losing the vast majority of their warmth up the wide, soot-choked chimneys while pulling freezing drafts of outside air across the floorboards to feed the combustion. To stay warm in the 1820s was to live in a state of constant proximity to the flame, creating a domestic geography where life was compressed into the small, golden circles of radiant heat, while the far corners of the rooms remained enveloped in a profound, bone-deep chill. The physical labor required to sustain this warmth was immense, involving the constant cutting, hauling, and stacking of massive quantities of seasoned hardwood, oak, maple, and hickory, which were burned at a staggering rate to combat the sub-zero temperatures. Every piece of wood represented hours of physical exertion, and the management of the embers was a vital skill, requiring the fire to be banked or covered with ash at night to ensure it could be easily revived in the freezing darkness of the morning. The olfactory landscape of the home was permanently defined by this struggle. A thick, pervasive aroma of wood smoke that saturated the heavy velvet curtains, the lath and plaster walls, and the very clothing of the family, becoming an inescapable part of their identity. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, when the fires were low and the house was enveloped in indigo shadow and pale blue moonlight, the cold would begin its slow, inevitable reclaim of the interior spaces, the temperature dropping rapidly as the thermal mass of the stone and timber surrendered to the night. This created a vertical climate within the home, where the air near the ceilings remained slightly warmer, holding the ghost of the day's fire, while the floors grew colder and colder, forcing the inhabitants to seek refuge beneath heavy wool blankets and thick feather mattresses. In some of the more progressive homes of this decade, the introduction of the cast iron stove offered a more controlled and efficient alternative to the open hearth. These heavy, black behemoths could radiate heat for hours and provided a surface for warming stones or bricks to be carried into the unheated bedrooms. Yet even with these innovations, the sensation of warmth remained a precious and fragile luxury, one that was constantly threatened by the howling winds and the creeping frost that painted intricate silver ferns across the rippled crown glass windows. The relationship between the inhabitant and the heat was one of intimate, tactile dependence, a nightly negotiation with the absolute darkness and the freezing void that was settled through the careful arrangement of the heavy, honest materials of the earth. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense and indigo light, the textures of the iron stoves and the grain of the wooden mantles were revealed in the cool, ethereal light. A silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping house, where the only movement was the slow, lazy drift of a stray spark, and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of the house contracting in the cold. Every object associated with heating, from the heavy brass bellows to the cold iron tongues, was a testament to a world where comfort required constant, vigilant physical effort. The weight of the logs, the roughness of the bark, the sharpness of the cold air, and the heavy, velvet silence of the cold air, and the heavy, velvet silence of the night, all combined to create a sensory experience that was both rugged and deeply honest, anchoring the 1820s family to the enduring laws of nature. As the household slept, the heating systems of the past stood as silent sentinels, their forms a promise of the morning's return. Beyond the thick masonry walls and the heavy, hand-forged bolts of the 1820s home, the nocturnal city existed as a vast, shifting landscape of profound shadow and intermittent, flickering illumination. A world that operated under a different set of physical and social laws once the sun had descended below the horizon. The transition from the private sanctuary of the hearth to the public realm of the street was a journey into a deep, indigo void, where the only defense against the absolute darkness was a primitive and strategically sparse network of oil lamps. These lanterns, often mounted on simple wooden posts or suspended from wrought iron brackets at key intersections, were fueled by the heavy, pungent oil of the sperm whale, a substance that provided a steady but remarkably dim light, casting a soft, amber glow that barely pushed back the encroaching blue mist for more than a few yards. To walk the streets at night was a tactile and auditory experience of intense isolation. The cobblestones beneath one's feet feeling cold, uneven, and often slick with the dampness of the evening fog, which rolled in from the nearby river or sea in thick, silent waves, muffling the sounds of the natural world and the distant, rhythmic clatter of the final horse-drawn carriages. The primary human presence in this midnight landscape was the night watchman, a solitary figure of authority and tradition who patrolled the designated wards with a slow, measured pace, his arrival announced by the steady, percussive strike of his heavy wooden staff against the stones, a sound that echoed through the narrow, high-walled alleys like a heartbeat in the silence. The staff was carved from a single piece of seasoned ash, its base tipped with a cold iron ferrule that struck the stone with a distinctive, metallic resonance. The watchman was typically clad in a long, heavy coat of coarse frieze wool, a material so dense it felt like a second skin, its surface permanently damp from the nocturnal mists. He carried a large, square lantern made of translucent horn, its flame dancing behind the protective barrier and casting long, frantic shadows that played across the textured brickwork and the shuttered windows of the sleeping houses. The horn panes gave the light a soft, organic diffusion, a milky quality that seemed to blend with the surrounding fog. The lantern's frame was made of hand-forged iron. The door secured by a simple, sliding latch that clicked softly in the dark. His duty was not merely to observe, but to vocalize the state of the night. His voice rising in a low, melodic chant to announce the hour and the weather, a call that was designed to reassure the inhabitants while serving as a deterrent to the desperate who moved in the deeper shadows. His heavy leather boots were reinforced with iron nails, creating a rhythmic, crunching sound on the frozen mud and gravel found in the smaller side streets. These minor sounds were magnified by the surrounding silence, making the city feel like a vast, living organism holding its breath. The scent of the night air was a complex map of the urban environment, dominated by the acrid aroma of the burning whale oil, the earthy smell of the damp masonry, and the faint, persistent tang of wood smoke lingering from the thousands of domestic chimneys. This atmosphere felt as heavy as velvet curtains. As the watchman moved through his circuit, he would occasionally stop to trim a wick using a small copper flask. The metallic clink of his tools and the soft, rhythmic shushing of the oil providing a brief counterpoint to the absolute quietude. The visual landscape was one of extreme contrast, where the pale, cool light of the moon would catch the slate rooftops and the glass panes, creating a silver-blue counterpoint to the flickering orange of the street lamps. The sense of enclosure was absolute, the buildings rising up like dark cliffs, their windows like blind eyes reflecting the starlight. In this era, the darkness was an active presence that dictated the limits of human activity. The night watchman was the guardian of this peace, a link between the households and the silent city, his presence providing security in a world where electric light was an impossible thought. He would occasionally look up at the moon, its position in the sky serving as his celestial clock. The relationship between the citizen and the night was one of humble, vigilant dependence. Every shadow a potential mystery, every sound a signal of endurance. As dawn approached, the oil in the lamps would slowly fail, leaving the streets to the absolute, moonlit peace, the weight of the staff, the warmth of the lantern, and the resonance of the call all combined to create a sensory experience, both rugged and deeply honest. As the city slept, the watchmen stood as silent sentinels, their forms a promise of the morning's return. Every flickering flame was a testament to a world where light was a precious luxury and the darkness was a sanctuary of indigo peace. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense indigo light, the textures of the cobblestones were revealed in the cool, ethereal glow. A silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping city, where the only movement was the lazy drift of a shadow and the only sound was the muffled sigh of the wind, providing a sense of security and continuity lost in the modern world. The experience of travel in the 1820s was defined by a profound physical intimacy with the landscape and the unrelenting rhythmic passage of time, a journey that transformed significantly as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world was surrendered to the deep indigo shadows of the rural night. For the traveler seated within the cramped, velvet-lined interior of a stagecoach, the transition to nocturnal movement was a sensory immersion into a realm of constant motion and absolute darkness. The coach itself was a heavy, suspended structure of seasoned oak and iron, designed to withstand the brutal, uneven topography of the unpaved turnpikes. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, the only illumination was provided by a pair of flickering oil lamps mounted high on the driver's box, casting two narrow amber cones of light that struggled to penetrate the thick blue mist rising from the damp fields and forest floors. These lamps, fueled by whale oil, emitted a sharp, acrid scent that mingled with the earthy aroma of wet horses and the metallic tang of the iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the cold, flinty stones. The motion was a relentless, percussive symphony of structural stress, the heavy creak of the leather thoroughbraces, the sudden, jarring snap of a wheel dropping into a rut, and the constant, rhythmic thud of the horse's hooves against the packed earth. Inside the cabin, the air was still and heavy, carrying the collective warmth of the passengers and the faint, dusty smell of the upholstery. The windows offered a distorted view of the passing world, where the skeletal forms of winter trees appeared to dance and shift in the pale blue moonlight. To travel at night was to exist in a state of suspended animation. Every stop at the roadside tavern was a ritual of profound transition. The sudden silence as the horses were brought to a halt, the metallic clink of the harness, and the heavy, muffled thud of the driver's boots hitting the ground. The tavern itself stood as a dark sentinel in the void, its windows reflecting the starlight and its chimneys emitting a low, pulsing orange glow from the banked fires. The interior of such a place at midnight was a study in profound shadow, the air thick with the scents of stale ale, wood smoke, and seasoned timber. Passengers would huddle near the cooling hearth, while the fresh team of horses was prepared in the absolute quiet of the stable yard. The relationship between the traveler and the night was one of humble, vigilant dependence. Every sound, from the distant hoot of an owl to the rustle of wind, was magnified by the surrounding silence, creating a landscape of mystery and endurance. As the coach pulled away, it plunged back into the deep, indigo peace of the open road. The weight of the leather, the coldness of the iron, and the roughness of the road all combined to create a sensory experience, both rugged and deeply honest, anchoring the 1820s journey to the enduring laws of gravity and motion. In the heart of the silent countryside, the stagecoach was a moving sanctuary, its lanterns the only stars on the terrestrial plane. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense, ethereal light, the textures of the road and the grain of the carriage were revealed in the cool, blue-tinted air. A silent vigil maintained throughout the long, restorative hours as the moon moved across the sky. The carriage settled into its nocturnal rhythm, a silent sentinel of progress in a world of shadow and starlight. The silence of the 1820s rural night was not an absence but a texture, a heavy velvet blanket that amplified every sound, turning the landscape into a vast acoustic mirror, and an immutable threshold between the enclosed domestic sphere and the wild nocturnal environment. The air was cool and heavy, saturated with the distinct olfactory map of the countryside, a complex blend of damp field soil, drying pine needles, and the sharp, earthy aroma of decaying leaf litter, illuminated only by the pale, ethereal blue light of the moon, which filtered through the skeletal forms of the ancient, bare-branched oaks, painting the ground with long, dramatic shadows that seemed to dance and shift with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. In the deep stillness of the midnight hour, the solitary sound of a barn owl's hollow, repetitive call provided a mournful counterpoint to the absolute quiet, a sound that defined the boundary of the isolated farmhouse. The soft, almost imperceptible shushing of its wings against the cold air, the only other noise as it patrolled the fields, a mechanically sustained churring of a nightjar would rise from the thick mist that clung low over the damp ground, a low, resonant hum that felt both ancient and reassuring, while the occasional, raspy bark of a fox would travel from the distant forest, a fleeting, environmental anchor of unmastered scale. In the warmer seasons, the air was alive with the rhythmic, aquatic pulse of spring peepers, their metallic, chirping chorus rising and falling like a tide, a sound that felt both primal and reliable, a testament to life continuing in the vast, blue-tinted shadows. The smell of damp pine wood was often sharp near the edges of the forest, while the faint fragrance of nocturnal flowers like the evening primrose would drift on the slight, cool breeze, creating a sensory geography that was both rugged and deeply comforting. The natural world in the 1820s night was not a threat, but a grounding presence, a reminder of the elemental forces that ultimately sustained the quiet, enduring world inside the stone and timber walls. As the moon moved across the indigo vault of the sky, the natural world settled into its deep, restorative rest, every sound a confirmation of presence, every silence a promise of duration. The relationship between the natural environment and the human world was one of humble, vigilant dependence, every shadow a mystery, every sound a signal of endurance, a silent vigil maintained in the heart of the sleeping countryside, where the only movement was the lazy drift of a stray shadow and the only sound was the deep, muffled sigh of the wind, providing a sense of security and continuity lost in the modern world of constant light and noise. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense indigo light, the textures of the frost on the grass and the grain of the weathered fence posts were revealed in the cool, ethereal glow. In the early 19th century, the atmospheric conditions and the cyclical patterns of the weather were the primary forces that dictated the sensory and physical boundaries of human existence, defining a world where the power of the natural elements was absolute and unmastered by future inventions. To experience a nocturnal storm in the 1820s was a profound immersion into the raw, elemental energy of the earth, an event that transformed the home into a fragile vessel anchored against the immense, churning void of the sky. The onset of such a tempest began with a shift in the olfactory map of the countryside. A sudden, sharp scent of ozone mingled with the damp aroma of saturated field soil and the resinous fragrance of pine needles being tossed in the rising wind. As the barometric pressure dropped, a thick, indigo mist would roll across the landscape, clinging low to the stone fences and the white planked floors of the outbuildings, creating a visual landscape where the skeletal forms of the ancient trees appeared to shift and groan with a slow, rhythmic intensity. The visual experience was defined by the profound darkness, punctuated by the rare, ethereal flashes of lightning that illuminated the rippled crown glass windows in brief, silvery blue bursts, revealing the frost on the glass. The sounds of the storm were a complex, percussive symphony of structural stress, the heavy, muffled thud of rain against the cedar shingles of the roof, the sudden, jarring snap of a timber branch yielding to the pressure, and the constant, rhythmic howl of the wind as it pulled through the narrow hand-carved chimneys and the ill-fitting door frames. Inside the home, the atmosphere became one of extreme enclosure and vigilant silence. The family huddling near the dying embers of the hearth, their faces illuminated by a low, pulsing orange glow that was too weak to banish the enshrouding gloom, but provided an anchor of warmth and security. A faint, acrid smell of an extinguished tallow candle, creating a sensory environment that felt substantial and profoundly quiet. Every sound from the natural world was magnified by the surrounding silence, the rhythmic drip of condensation, the soft, rhythmic shush of the long wool curtains moving in a phantom draft, or the distant, hollow roll of thunder that felt like a vibration in the foundations. This was a world where the weather was an active, living presence, requiring a humble, vigilant dependence. To stay warm was a matter of manual labor, involving the careful banking of the fire, the securing of the wooden shutters, and the arrangement of the thick hand-woven wool blankets. It was a relationship of endurance, a tactile bond that defined the physical reality of the 1820s life. As the moon was obscured by the dense, midnight clouds, the house became a silent sentinel in the void, its forms reflecting the starlight. Every mile was a testament to the reliability of the natural materials. The seasoned timber, the forged iron, and the steady pulse of the earth itself. As the night progressed, the storm would surrender to the deep indigo peace of the dawn, leaving behind a world that was still and refreshed, providing a sense of security and continuity. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its indigo light, the frost and the grain were revealed in the cool, ethereal glow. The reliance on seasonal preservation in the early 19th century meant that the transition from autumn to winter was marked by a profound movement of nourishment from the fields and orchards into the secure darkness of the domestic storage spaces, defining a world where survival was measured by the density of the larder and the root cellar. These were the quiet, cool sanctuaries that guarded the household's sustenance throughout the long, restorative months of frost and deep indigo shadows. Entering the root cellar in the deep stillness of the midnight hour, the immediate sensation was one of enclosed, unyielding stability. A temperature that remained perpetually above freezing, but profoundly cold. A climate dictated by the massive, unpolished fieldstones or heavy, hearth-fired bricks that lined the subterranean walls. This was the lowest stratum of the domestic landscape, filled with the distinct olfactory map of the earth, a complex aroma composed of damp field soil, dormant roots, and the faint, resinous scent of the seasoned timber bins. The visual landscape was a study in absolute indigo and charcoal blue gloom, illuminated only by the rare, ethereal light of the moon filtering through a tiny barred ground-level window, painting distorted geometric patterns across the uneven flagstone floor. In the deep corners, massive wooden bins held the root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, and heavy, soil-encrusted potatoes buried in dry, coarse sand to mimic the dark, insulating environment of the garden. Alongside them sat the ceramic crocks of preserved goods, stoneware vessels with salt-glazed surfaces featuring deep, cobalt blue decorations that seemed to pulse with life in the dim, starlit air, holding pickles, salted pork, and hard-boiled eggs suspended in a sharp, amber brine. Above these subterranean chambers sat the larder, a slightly warmer but still cool enclosure typically located on the north side of the house, its walls draped with a forest of drying herbs, sage, thyme, and rosemary that cast long, bulbous shadows against the plaster. These dried goods added a warm, dry layer to the complex sensory geography of the early 19th century home, creating a scent that felt substantial, grounded, and deeply comforting. The shelves were packed with the results of the summer's pickling, jars of fruit preserves, chutneys, and heavy earthenware jugs of vinegar and cider. In the deep stillness of the night, these spaces stood as dark, silent sentinels of domestic security. The contents of every crock, every sack of rough burlap, and every hanging braid of onions was a testament to hours of vigilant care and communal labor. Every surface, every worn texture recorded the passage of time and the history of the household's negotiation with the natural world. As the moon reached its zenith, casting its most intense indigo light, the textures of the stone and the grain of the wood were revealed in the cool, ethereal glow. A silent vigil maintained throughout the long restorative hours of the night. The final hour of the 1820s night arrived with a slow, almost imperceptible transition from the deep, all-consuming indigo of the midnight vault to the first, fragile gray of the approaching dawn, marking the conclusion of a journey through 30 distinct realms of shadow, silence, and profound domestic endurance. This was the moment of the most absolute stillness, when the thermal mass of the masonry walls had surrendered the last of the day's warmth to the freezing air, and the house stood as a cold, silent sentinel in the heart of the steeping landscape. The sensory geography of this final phase was defined by a profound, velvet quietude that seemed to muffle the very passage of time, a silence so thick it possessed a physical weight, pressing against the rippled crown-glass windows and the heavy, hand-hewn timber beams of the structure throughout the rooms. The olfactory map of the 19th century world reached its most complex and evocative state. A dense, layered aroma composed of the lingering wood smoke from the banked hearths, the sharp, acrid scent of the extinguished tallow candles, the sweet, earthy fragrance of the lavender sachets tucked in the mahogany drawers, and the raw, ozone-rich smell of the morning mist seeping through the ill-fitting door frames. In the deep stillness of the bedchamber, the inhabitant was anchored to the earth by the immense, tactile reality of the natural fibers. The heavy, hand-woven wool blankets, the coarse flax linen sheets, and the cloud-like envelope of the goose-down feather bed. These materials, harvested and crafted with tireless physical labor, provided the final, essential sanctuary against the biting chill of the pre-dawn hours, creating a private ecosystem of humid, wool-bound warmth that allowed for the deepest, most restorative state of human rest. The visual landscape was a study in subtle, shifting tones of charcoal blue and silver, as the pale, cool light of the setting moon cast its final, elongated shadows across the white planked floors and the textured Latin plaster walls, revealing the dust motes dancing in the still interior air, one last time before they were banished by the morning light. In the service areas, the silence was even more profound. The cold flagstones of the kitchen and the damp, stone-lined walls of the cellar, standing as silent witnesses to the domestic discipline and the tireless cycle of preservation that sustained life in an era before the luxury of automation, every object in the home, from the heavy iron-bound barrels of the root cellar to the delicate, brass-handled bureaus of the parlor, was a testament to a world where comfort was a hard-won, localized, and profoundly honest commodity. A world where the boundary between the self and the environment was marked by the weight of stone, the grain of wood, and the rhythmic, percussive sounds of the natural world, as the first distant call of a bird broke the nocturnal seal. The 1820s house remained in its state of suspended animation, a sanctuary of indigo peace that allowed the spirit to find a refuge in the absolute honesty of the material world. The relationship between the human soul and the night was one of humble, vigilant dependence, a nightly negotiation with the cold and the dark that was settled through the careful arrangement of the heavy, honest materials of the earth. Every shadow held a history, every silence a promise of duration, and every texture a record of the labor required to maintain order in a world of profound quietude. As the documentary finishes, the spirit of the 1820s remains anchored in the silence and the shadow, a testament to the quiet, enduring beauty of an age that understood the value of rest and the profound power of the night. The journey through these 30 chambers of memory has revealed a world of texture and silence, a place where the soul could retreat from the labors of the day and find refuge in the absolute honesty of the night. As the light shifts from the deep indigo of midnight to the soft, cool gray of dawn, the domestic ritual begins anew: fire lighting, water drawing, and the tireless maintenance of life. But for now, the house remains a silent sentinel. It forms a promise of the morning's return and the inevitable renewal of the domestic order, providing a sense of security and continuity that is almost entirely lost in the modern world of constant light and noise. As the moon reached its zenith and then slowly descended, the house settled into its foundations, its occupants surrendering to the final, restorative minutes of deep sleep. The journey is finished. The indigo piece remains,